So just a quick review of the cohorts and students Django app. Right now, we're able to list all the cohorts, visit an individual cohort, edit a cohort, delete a cohort, and create a new cohort as well. Like Oscar, I'll just do one. I don't know if these dates are correct, but yeah. All right, so we're able to create cohorts as well. So now let's get to the nested part. So when I visit a cohort like Charlie or Bravo, I want to link and where I'm able to go to cohorts/cohort ID/students. And I want to be able to be able to see all the students associated with that cohort. Someone have a question? Oh, all right. So we can pretty much repeat the process again that we did with cohorts, but do it with students. And it looks very similar to this, except we just keep on appending to the URL. So, for example, if we want to view the cohort's students by going to cohort ID/students, we'll come down here. And so up here are my cohort URLs. And down here, I'm going to create my student URLs. So I'm going to do path. Again, I'm going to go to the cohort ID/students. So I visit a specific cohort ID. I want to be able to visit the students associated with that cohort ID. So here, I'm going to do views. Instead of cohort list, I'm going to do student. What is it? Student list. The name equals student underscore list. Any questions? What questions do you have about that URL pattern? So it's pretty much the same here. We go to /cohorts, we get a list of cohorts. Here we go to cohorts ID/students. So if you think of like students being where cohorts is at, we're going to grab a list of students associated with this cohort.
Yeah, get that. I'm just curious, will there be a route for all students though? Also, are we going to use this to later build that all students route with all cohorts or something? Or
so you can add to that. So if you wanted to just have a list of all the students, you can build that custom route if you wanted to. So if you wanted to build a route that lists literally just all the students instead of just the students associated with the cohort, you can do, well, you would probably have to adjust your project URLs for that because that it starts with cohorts/cohorts. So you might look at so yeah, anyway. Like if you really wanted to, you can go to the project URLs, get rid of that cohorts and like that, and just add cohorts to all of them now. So just like cohorts here, and then prepend cohorts to all of that. And then if you wanted just like a separate route to students, where it's just like /students to list all the students, you can do that. But we just want to view all the students associated with each cohort.
Thanks.
But yeah, like you can make any route you want, go anywhere and display whatever you want. But for this nested CRUD, we want to display the cohort ID, students, and then eventually the student ID when we get to an individual student. Any good question? So we have a student list. Anybody else? What other questions do you have about this URL pattern?
Do you need the greater than sign after the cohort ID?
Yay. Do you? Oh, Yes, you do. Thank you. All right, so again, let's go through the process. We created our URL pattern. Now let's go into our view and get a students. So up here, this is our cohort view methods. Now let's come down here and let's create our student view methods. So we have def, what is it? Student underscore list takes in the request. What else do we take in though? If we look at our URL,
The ID.
we can take in the cohort ID. So cohort underscore ID. And now we can use that helper method that get cohort ID. So that grabs the individual cohort. And does anybody remember how we can go from a cohort instance and grab all the students associated with that cohort?
Cohort.students.
I'm sorry, was that James? Was it?
Yeah, so it's a cohort.students.all.
Yep.
Yeah, sign up.
Cohort.students, and the students right here, that's that related name in our models. So that's what that is for. So cohort.students.all. And there, that grabbed all of our students associated with that cohort. And we can return, render. We can render the request. And we're going to create a students directory that holds all of our student templates now. So students underscore list.html. And we can say like, so we have our cohort. So let's actually keep, because we're going to pass in our cohort as well into our template. So we have our cohort and we have, say, all students and student. For this, I'm going to do all students. Like so. So we've got a cohort and we have all of our students. So now in our templates, let's create a directory called students. And in here, we're going to have to create probably the same templates that we did before, but let's just create one at a time. So let's create a student, whoop, not a directory, a file students underscore list.html. So if we come over here, we can grab our students list. Let's do H1. So we can do all students for cohort underscore name. And again, we're gonna have a list of students. Just make it let's just kind of like emulate what like the cohorts page does, just like a list of students. So we can say for student and all students. And do N4. Like so. And then here, we're going to have a list of, say student dot first name. And also student dot last name. All right. So again, I created my URL to cohort ID /students, created a view method just for student list. Inside that student list view method, it takes in that cohort ID that's in the URL. I grab that cohort from the database. I do a query off that instance, that cohort instance, cohort.students.all to grab all the students associated with that cohort, assign that to a variable called all students. And I'm rendering the students list HTML template where I'm passing in the cohort instance, as well as the all, like a list of all the students. So if I refresh this, and if I go to Bravo, and I'll probably have to update this detail page, but I'm just going to go to students / just student /. And there we go. We have a list of all the students for Bravo. And if I go to Charlie Platoon, I get a list of students for Charlie. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and make that cohort detail page a little bit, so I can actually go to students. So cohort list, maybe I want to go to the student list where cohort_ID equals cohort.id. I can then say view all students in cohort.cohort_name, like so. So if I actually just go to Charlie Platoon, I can say view all students in Charlie cohort. There we go. Questions about that? All right. So now we created a student list. Now let's go ahead and create a student detail. So just like we did with cohorts, with cohort ID, we're going to add student ID. And this is where the nested, we're going to have more than one integer in here. So we go to path cohort / or cohort ID, followed by students, followed by student ID. And that's going to display or go to a student detail view method. So created my route for that. Go into my view. I can def was it student_detail. But here, instead of just taking in the request and the cohort ID, I'm also taking in the student_ID as well. Because in this URL, we have the cohort ID and the student ID. So the placement of that, I believe, matters. So whatever URL comes first needs to become first in what's passed in as well to this method. So in here, I can do the same thing. We're grabbing the cohort. So I'm grabbing that cohort instance by passing in that cohort ID. But let's also create, instead of get cohort, let's go ahead and create a helper method called get student that just returns an individual student. So I can come up here, or let's actually go all the way up here for the helper functions. So get cohort. I'm going to create another method called get_student that takes in that student_ID. And it returns an individual student object. I'm passing in that student ID. So if I scroll down here, I've got a cohort instance and a student instance. Now I can return render the request students/student_detail.html. And in here, I'm going to pass in the cohort instance as well as the student instance. All right. What questions do you have about the student detail route or view?
Tom, just in regards to the assessment, is a lot of this going to be transferable? Because it all, I think it makes sense to me. It seems very logical, but obviously just kind of implementing it off the top of your head is always a little tricky. So will it be pretty easy to like call back on this and be able to translate that over?
All right. I don't know why I didn't record that. It doesn't really matter. All right. This is going to be very similar to what's going to be on the assessment. All right. So we've got the student detail route. What questions do you have about the student detail view method? Nothing?
Would you mind going to your urls.py file for a moment, just so I can take it in for a second? Thank you. Like, I know, Tom, you mentioned that the route, like we can make whatever route we want. Like we could rearrange where, like we could have students first, and then we could have the integer for the cohort, and then followed by // and then the integer for the student ID. Like it's up to us how we devise that layout. Is that basically right?
You can, but this is best practice. This is called restful routing. So anytime you're like digging deeper into something like for example, a cohort, there's a cohort and students belong to a cohort. So you want to have cohort ID followed by /students to list all the students out / followed by a student ID. So it's best practice to go like this is essentially best practice. But in theory, you can create whatever you want. You can have student ID here and cohort ID here, but that would really, I don't know what that would make a whole lot of, that wouldn't really make a whole lot of sense from like a restful routing standpoint.
Gotcha. That helps. I appreciate it, Tom.
But yeah, in theory, you can create whatever URL you want to go to whichever direction you want. All right. So we've got our view method. We have our student detail. Now we have to create a student detail HTML template. So we have our student list, student _ detail.html. All right. So our student detail. Oh, that's not anything. All right. So here we're going to have H2. This is, we're going to have the first name. So student dot first _ name. We're going to also have their last name as well. Last _ name. And we're going to have member of the, I'll just do what cohort they're a member of, cohort _ name. So yeah, we'll just leave it at that for right now, and we'll add, to be able to edit and delete this user as well. So let's refresh that. And if I wanted to go to, let's actually make a link to that in the student detail or student list. So right here in the students list, let's go ahead and make an A tag for a link. Like so. And we can make that an href. Let's make this URL student _ detail. I now here, when we're linking to this route, we need to add in the cohort ID equals cohort.id, as well as the student _ ID equals student.id. Because when we go to that route, the individual detail route, we need to pass in that cohort ID. We need to pass in that cohort ID and that student ID.
Hey, Tom.
Yep.
On that URL, it's completely kosher to just do like cohort underscore I or cohort.id and student.id, right? Like we don't have to specify which ones if we're doing it in order.
Yeah, so like right here. So if you, I don't know, it's been a long time, but I think that might work. Don't quote me on that, but that's why I specify what those are associated with. Because it
So
might,
that's
I
the best
might,
practice.
yeah. Yeah, I would do it this way. All right. So we've got links now. Now, if I click on Arthur M, it takes me to Arthur M, member of Charlie. So we got cohorts, ID, students, 5. Now I can go to like 3 and it'll still probably work, but Charlie, but like it'll display and not, it'll actually get it wrong. So it says Arthur M, member of Papa. I'll fix that. But Arthur is not a member of Papa. So there might be, you might want to add some like error handling in there.
I'm just thinking, I mean, because I mean, is there really a need for the ID of the cohort in the route?
Yeah, if you want to display what cohort they're a part of in the student detail page, yes.
You can get it from the student object, though, right? It's linked where I can get the cohort from the student object.
Yeah,
So,
you
I
can
mean,
do that too.
Yeah, it could be cohort/student/4, and then you wouldn't have that problem because wouldn't there be a problem when you have like you just showed where you have to make sure we have the correct ID of the cohort and the correct ID of the student because they may not be linked because the student is incremented forward, not I don't know.
The main thing we just want to show you as well is that you can have it nested and do stuff with those objects as well. So you just want to show you the capabilities of what this is useful for as well.
Got it.
Yep. And that it's nested and stuff. But yeah, you're exactly right. You don't necessarily need the cohort because when I was going through this, I was like, why am I even getting the cohort? Like I can access it on the student object, you know? All right, so we created a student detail. I'm gonna bring all that to that side of, all right. So we've got student detail. Now, these are just design decisions on how you want your application to work. So I'm gonna create a new student and I wanna create a new student. Yeah, let's see. Yeah. So let's go ahead and create a new student, just like we did cohort/new, but I want to create a new student that's associated with a specific cohort. So path, again, I'm just going to be using integer/students. /students/new. So here I'm going to try to let's just assume we're just creating a new student and you can select whatever cohort you want to exist, whatever the student you can manually select what cohort this student exists, even independent of whatever ID they're on. And you'll see what I'm talking about here. So I'm going to views/new_student. Name equals new student. All right, so I've got a path to that. Now I'm going to my views and def new_student takes in the request, take in the cohort ID, and these are design decisions you can make right now. So you don't have to do it like this. I don't even know. I might even change it just because we'll see. what happens, because the overall user experience isn't that great. So I'm going to grab the cohort by get cohort by the cohort ID, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. So just like we did with the new student or new cohort, just like we did up here, we're going to pretty much do the exactly same thing down here, but for students. So if request dot method equals a post request. So actually, before I even jump into that, let's just return the form. So I'm going to do form equals student form. So I'm creating a new student form, and I'm going to return render the request students / student underscore form HTML. And just like we did up here, is this edit request? So that's edit. So that should actually be edit. We're doing the form, we're passing in that form, and the type of request is it's going to be a new student. And before I fill this out, I just kind of want to show you what kind of like a design decision. So I created new student, which I'll be editing later to actually add a student with the post request, but I'm going to add the student form, student underscore form dot HTML. And in here, this is where it's doing H2. Do the type of form. It's going to be a new student. We're going to create a form. And this is where that form dot as underscore P. And the method is a post request. And this is where that we have that CSRF token there. And we can have a button, save student. And the type is a submit button. So now let's actually just link to this. Let's create a link in our student detail. Let's make an A tag, or not in the student detail. We want it to be in the student list. So here, let's make an HR, add new student. So this is in our student list. We're going to link to URL, new student. And I think we still need to pass in the cohort ID equals cohort.id. All right, let's just go back and refresh. So here we have add a new student. When I click there, it adds a new student, or we have a new student form. Now, what do we want to do with the form? So I'm technically inside of Charlie Platoon, and I'm clicking add a new student. But with this dropdown, I can add it to any student I want. The question is, should we be able to allow the user to select any cohort, even while they're in the Charlie Platoon, or regardless of what they select, should it always save to Charlie Platoon?
I think with the routing that we have, it should only show the cohort that we're in. If you're in 2, it should be 2, in my opinion.
Yeah. All right. So I don't quite know how to do this off the top of my head, but we're in the student form. We have that cohort ID in there. Or we have the cohort instance. If we want to pre-fill a specific field with a value, we can pass in a dictionary with the field name followed by whatever value we want, which in this case, we have to pass in a cohort instance because in the student form, a cohort is a cohort instance. So if I come back here and I go back and I refresh and I click new, add new student, it pre-fills Charlie right here. But off the top of my head, I don't know how to make this grayed out where I can't select it. There is a way, I just don't know off the top of my head. And this field is required automatically, so it's just this automatically occurs here because these two fields are required. So should we only allow the user, even if they select Papa Platoon and click save, should they only user only be allowed to save to Charlie Platoon? Just random question. Or no?
I mean, if there was a way to not even show the cohort selection and just make the selection in the back end and then just show the text of what platoon they're in. Because if they select Papa, but then we change it in the back end to Charlie, that's just confusing for the user. So even if it's pre-populated as Charlie, so I would say if we could just remove it completely from the form or hide it from the form, that'd be the way to go. But
in your form model, can't you take out cohort as part of the, I mean, it'll still be attached to the object, but it won't be in the form model for you to fill in for the form.
Yeah, and that exactly, we could do that, but that will raise another question. What if we want to edit a student? Would we allow the field name to be editable? Or I'm sorry, the cohort name to be, or cohort to be editable? That's where these are just these are things I'm trying to like, hey, these are things to think about. And I also wanted to show you that you can pre-fill some fields as well. For this design decision, I'll just say that they're able to edit it in here as well, even if they add it, but it'll default to the cohort they're in. So if I want a new student like Tom Reed and click save, it doesn't do anything now. But here, so when I click that submit, please mute. I'm gonna do if request dot method equals post. I could say form equals student form. And this is where we're passing in the request dot post. We could say if form dot is valid. Well, we can do some stuff. Let's see. All right. I'm going to do student, just like I'm doing up here with this part. I can do student. So student.form.save, everything's the same. And now here, I'm going to return redirect. That takes in, where do I want to redirect myself to? I want to redirect myself to the student detail page. So I can do student underscore detail. But now I want to redirect myself to this, because if I do change it to like Oscar, I want to change to the this ID as well up here. Because if I changed it to Oscar, this ID would change. So I can say cohort underscore ID equals student dot cohort dot ID and student underscore ID equals student dot ID. And then else. I'm going to assume it's a GET request. So let's just run through this. Let's go back, refresh that. So let's just see if I can add a new student to Charlie Platoon. So I'll say Tom, read, save. So Tom's a member of Charlie. Say I'm here on Charlie and I switch to Oscar and save it. Watch, the ID is 5 right here and see if 5 changes up there. There, it's changed to 5. So now I'm on the Oscar route. So just quick refresher, new student takes in the cohort ID. I grab that cohort. I don't necessarily need this. If I want it for this part to fill in pre-filled, I do. So I'm grabbing the cohort instance. I'm saying, hey, if the method is a post request, means I want to save it. I type in the form, I save student. I'm checking if the form is valid. I save the student to the database. Then I redirect myself to the cohort ID because this route needs a cohort ID. And I'm grabbing the cohort ID from the new student instance. So student.cohort.id. And the student ID is just student.id. So that's where that route, that 5 and 8 come from. Else, I'm just doing a student form and I'm passing in, I'm pre-filling the dropdown with whatever cohort I'm currently on.
Can I see your forms model real quick for student form? Okay, thank you.
And I'll leave it up to you all to research it, but you can edit, you can make changes to these forms, this form stuff in here. There's different attributes and different variables you can change in here within this student form class. So you're not just limited to this, you can also make edits to this student form class, which would also update this.
I got a question about that actually. And I mean, you're able to make edits to the actual like classes and stuff like CSS in there. Something
Yes.
I was messing around with before.
Yeah, you can. So it's not just so bleak looking. But yeah, you can make changes that way. It's not easy, and I would say don't spend a whole lot of time with it because we're gonna be moving away from these types of forms. All right, so we've got our student form. We're able to create new students. Let's go back to our URLs. So we just created a new student. We're able to view a student. So can list all the students, view an individual student, and create a new student. Now, just like the last two, we can edit a student and delete a student. So let's go ahead and edit a student. Let's do, we're going to be using this path. So edit student / edit, use edit student, name, edit _ student. So we created that URL. Let's go down to that view. So def edit student takes in the request, the cohort underscore ID and the student underscore ID. And now here we can grab the student instance by doing get underscore student, student underscore ID. I don't know if we need the cohort right now, but I'm just going to go ahead and grab that the cohort as well. So cohort and cohort. So I'm just grabbing the student instance and the cohort instance right now. And very similar to what we did up at edit, we can do the same thing for edit cohort. We can pretty much do the same thing for new student or edit student. So if request dot method equals a post request, we can say form equals student form, and here we're going to pass in the request dot post as well as the instance of the student. When saying if form dot is valid, I'm going to pretty much do the same thing right here, like so. Else form equals student form. And in here, I'm going to pass in the instance. So the form is already filled out. And I'm going to return render. Same thing right here. With the student form, I'm returning render request student form, passing in that form instance. And instead of new, it's going to be edit. Like
Tom,
so.
I know we've covered this before, but I'm just trying to make sure I'm following. On line 80, we've got this form. We're sending the dictionary, which is the post, like the post attribute of request or whatever. I get that. And when we do instance equals student, the student right there is referring to that variable on line 77. And we're just trying to link up the data that's in the post with that student instance. Is that basically what we're doing there?
I don't want to say we're going to link that. Well, yes. No, yeah, you're all right. We are linking this post when we're going to be saving it to the student instance in the database, as well as if we make any changes or if we don't make any changes to any fields, it won't like override it with a null. So it already is like pre-filled out.
Gotcha. Thank you very much, Tom.
Yep. So it doesn't look like I'm using this cohort ID in here. I don't think I need it anymore. So I can pretty much disregard that. So I created that view. Now, what am I doing? Let's go ahead and actually like try to edit a student. So I'm going to go to the student detail and I'm going to create a link to that student href URL. What was it? Is it edit underscore student? And I'm going to pass in the cohort ID equals cohort dot ID and student underscore ID equals student dot ID. So I'm going to edit the student. Hopefully that works. So if I come over here and just list all the students, I want to edit Tom, member of Charlie. If I want to edit the student, Tom is a member of Charlie Platoon. If I wanted to change it to Papa Platoon and say Tom Anthony, I can save it. And now Tom Anthony is so cool. I can edit it. Is there anything else? All right. Any questions about editing a student? All right. Now the last one, again, create, read, update, now destroy or delete. I'm going to copy that down there because it's the same. Again, delete a student. And I come over here to my views. Def delete student, taking the request, cohort underscore ID, which I don't think I'll need. Maybe I will, we'll see. Cohort ID, student underscore ID. So I can, if request dot method equals a post request, I can get that student from the database. So get student by their student ID. And I can do student dot delete. And regardless, I'm going to return redirect, and I'm going to go to the student list in whatever cohort I'm looking at. So cohort ID equals cohort underscore ID. So after I delete a student, I want to go back to the list of students inside of that cohort. So inside of my student detail, I can create a form. And this form as a method equals post. And the action I want to go to the URL, delete student. And the student I want to delete, I can use the cohort underscore ID equals cohort dot ID and student underscore ID equals student dot ID. I do button, delete student dot first name. And last name. And that type of button, that's a submit button. All right, so I created a form. The method is post. The action, I'm going to go to the URL delete student. I'm passing in the cohort ID and the student ID. And I'm just going to display a delete the username. So when I click that button, it's going to go over to here to my URLs. It's going to look for that named route, student, delete student. It's going to look through here. Hey, I found that one. It's going to pass in that cohort ID that comes from this cohort ID. It's going to pass in that student ID that comes from the student ID. And it's going to delete this student, go to this delete student view method, comes over here, delete the student. If the request that method is post, which it is in the student detail HTML, it's going to grab the student from the database, delete that student, and then redirect me to the student list where that cohort ID, the student list associated with that cohort ID. So if I come back here, and I go to cohorts and I go to Oscar Platoon, I can view all students in Oscar cohort. I see Ankur Shah. I'm going to delete him. So delete Ankur Shah. Uh-oh, CSRF token failed. In my form, I got that, forgot the CSRF token. Let's see if I go back and refresh, delete Ankur, all students for Oscar Platoon. Doesn't look like there is anything. So I can go to that student list. Where's that student list? And this is where I can have some like logic in here. If all students and if, or I can do like else. H3, no students in cohort underscore name. Make sure indentation is good. Yeah, whatever. So if I refresh that, no students in Oscar. Maybe I can add students. So maybe this stuff has to go at the very bottom. Want to add a new student. Charlie. All right. I can delete Tom. They're not students in Charlie. Huh. Oh, something's going on. If all students, there we go. There we go. All right. Is there anything else? Let's see. Do I need? All right. So that is nested CRUD. What questions do you have about this nested part, the nested route of CRUD? Any questions? I know somebody has a question.